Okay, well, this is the gender session of the online water course. We are here gathered with four experts on gender. And what we will be doing, we will, rather than giving a boring lecture about why gender is important and what to do about gender, we thought let's gather these four experts who come from different regions of the world and work for different organizations and have a discussion on what are the questions and what can we do about it. So before we start, I would like to ask all of you just to briefly introduce yourself.
Okay,
go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Saskia Evans. I'm the coordinator of the Gender Equality Unit of the Dutch Sustainability Unit. We provide support to embassies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, particularly in the spearheads of water and food security.
My name is Margreet Zwarteveen. I'm an associate professor at the University of Wageningen at the Water Resources Management Group. And a lot of my work has actually been on gender and water.
I'm Deepa Joshi. I'm from South Asia and I've been working on gender and water, but also on poverty and equity issues, primarily in South Asia and also in other parts of the world, and have a very mixed background of having worked in managing projects as well as doing research, and now I'm here based with Margaret at the Water Resource Management Group of Wageningen University, where I work as an assistant professor and I focus on water conflicts in South Asia.
Hello, I'm Esther de Jong. I'm the Deputy Director of the Gender and Water Alliance. The Gender and Water Alliance is an international alliance of people working in the water sector who try to mainstream gender in their own work, be it at policy level, project level, or within research.
Okay, fantastic. So we will be asking a few questions, discussing the key topics within water and water management. So can I start with you, Margreet? What are the key gender questions in water, according to you?
Well, I always identify three main questions if we talk about gender in water. The first question is really the big gap there is in terms of gender between rights and responsibilities. Most of the water rights everywhere in the world are vested in men. So men have the rights to water, but also the rights to land that often are associated with water. But also it's mostly men who have formal voice in decision making and in water users associations. But on the other hand, women do have a lot of responsibilities in water. So they carry water, they do a lot of work in irrigated agriculture. So they have a lot of water responsibilities, but without the rights. So that is a problem of justice and equity, but also a problem of sustainability and efficiency. So that is the first big question. The second big question in gender and water is the extreme male dominance of the water sector. The water sector consists, I don't know numbers, but my estimate would be 80 to 90% of experts in water are men, almost everywhere in the world. There are differences, but for instance, here in the Netherlands, that's also true. The water sector is more male dominant than, for instance, the construction sector. So in terms of gender, that's also a problem. It's a problem of equity and justice, but it's also a problem of a lack of diversity in the sector. And then the third big gender problem in water is the fact that a lot of water expertise and water knowledge is very technical and is very engineering based. So that comes with a very specific language and a very specific way of looking at the world, which makes it very difficult to recognize social questions and social issues, and also gender questions. So these are the three, I was going to write them down, I can still do it. So the first is rights, the gap between rights and responsibilities. The second is male dominance of the sector and of expertise. And the third is let's call it a technocratic way of looking at the world.
Okay, so fantastic. So let's discuss these three questions together. Margreet, would you be able to explain the first one, rights and responsibilities?
Yeah, well, maybe that is best explained with one example that is maybe already an old example, but it's also a very telling example, is the example of how a lack of awareness of this gap between rights and responsibilities led to big failures in the design and implementation of irrigation projects in the 1980s. What happened here was the irrigation projects often went accompanied with a complete redesign of large landscapes and areas, also reallocating rights to land and rights to water. And especially in Africa, but also for instance in Sri Lanka, what happens, these reallocations of land and water completely denied prior rights and prior gender divisions of labor. So all rights, new rights, went to men. Whereas at the same time, the project success depended on a lot of work, free family labor of women. And in many cases, women were not very eager to provide that labor because they were not sure of actually benefiting from the incomes. Because the rights to land were in the hands of men, their brothers, fathers, husbands, and it was not automatic that they would share the benefits of the harvest or the incomes with their wives, not because they were evil, but just because that was not how traditionally rights and responsibilities at the household level were divided. And that in turn led to a failure of projects because the labor of women was not forthcoming. So yields were disappointing, etc. But it also led to misery, to women finding it very difficult to feed their families, etc. So this is really the question of rights and responsibilities, which is of course very much linked to how tasks and divisions are organized at the household level.
Fantastic. So I think a lot of people can relate to these examples. I think Esther had a slightly different way of explaining.
Yes. Well, normally the way I explain it is everybody knows this picture of the African woman with a bucket on her head carrying water from a well or a pump for how many kilometers back home. When projects start, then often engineers or project managers are interested to involve the local population to make their project successful. So the entry point has long been to whom to talk. Well, let's talk to the decision makers because they decide where the pump will be, and these decision makers used to be men. But these men had never carried a bucket of water. They didn't know where their woman went to because they just drank their water and they never thought about where does it come from. That's my wife's responsibility. So when you have a practical problem like a water project, it is very important to talk to those who know. And those who know are women and not necessarily only the decision makers. So that is how I explain it.
Fantastic. Now we have two explanations. Deepa, is there anything to add to this, to the key questions in water, in particular to rights and responsibilities?
Yeah, let me stir this up a little bit. I think what my colleagues Margaret and Esther were talking about are these, the strategic structural inequalities between women and men. And indeed, that is true pretty much in many different parts of the world where, a lot of water-related responsibilities at the household level are allocated to women. But I think it's really important to also think about, is that the only form of inequality that exists in society? And Esther, you were talking about African women with buckets on their head. That reminds me of this very famous quote by a group of African women who asked, when they were being presented with this women, environment and development discourse and dialogues, they made a quote by saying, why are you focusing on African women now? And has colonialism in the past always been kind to African men as well? And turning that around, I want to say that there are also a subset of inequalities that come under gender inequalities that really bring out the issues of differences between women. And these could be class, and that applies fairly much everywhere, but they could be ethnicity, race, disability, etc. These, these are just some of the issues that I'm talking about, which don't necessarily put all women or all men into sort of equal footings in society. And I think the structure of inequality by gender is that both of these are very real. Inequalities that exist between women and men, as well as inequalities that exist between women and between men. And I think it's important to pay attention to both these.
Okay, fantastic. So I think that explains a lot about rights and responsibilities and the key issues that we are looking into when, for example, we design projects and programs or develop policy. Esther, could I ask you to say a little more about the second aspect on male dominance?
Male dominance, yes. Well, as explained, the Gender and Water Alliance is an alliance of people working in the water sector and worldwide. And many of our members are women, many of our members are men. But I've been talking to quite a few female water engineers who have been explaining to me, yes, I did study water issues, I did study technical issues, but I have left the water sector because it was such a male-dominated working environment. I could not stand it any longer. I could not function properly. So this is really a difficulty of also breaking that male dominance of the sector.
Okay, and Margreet, would you be able to say a little more there? Why is it so difficult for women in this sector and to increase the number of women in this sector? And at the same time, do you have any suggestions, any solutions, what to take into account when you design a new project, for example?
Yeah, well, we have been doing some studies, or not just me, but we have been involved in a couple of studies about the masculinity of the sector in South Asia. And what is very clear, and why that's also why it's very difficult to change, is that the definitions of professional performance and professional quality are very tightly linked to definitions of masculinity. So almost like being a good man, to be a good engineer, to be a good water professional equals being a good man. Which also means that if you're a woman, by definition you cannot be a good engineer, because the two exclude each other. So and that makes it very difficult. So as the stories we have of women professionals who do succeed actually show how they constantly have to renegotiate their gender or the terms of professional expertise. But it's also true for men if they want to behave a little bit differently as engineers. For instance, if they suddenly want to really pay attention to social issues or to gender questions, they also need to renegotiate both their gender. And so that is what makes it very difficult and very resilient. And
any solutions, any suggestions, like if an embassy staff member designs a new project, like this is difficult to tackle, this is difficult to deal with, what could they do? What could they take into account?
Oh yeah, often these projects start with or assume a gender training is enough. Let's do a gender training with staff in engineering organizations or with water experts, and those are often good, those trainings, but they are not enough. My experience is that the trainings help, but my experience in Nepal, in Kathmandu, is that there are many engineers who have had several gender trainings. They know about gender, they know all the tools, they know the methods, they know the guidelines, and many of them, not all of them of course, but many of them are also well-intentioned. They're engineers, they want to do their jobs well. But then this also requires a change in the entire professional culture, but it also requires that they are held accountable for changing what they do, and so it also requires changes in how their performance is measured, which is, of course, those two things are much longer processes. that really require longer term engagement, and that won't happen overnight. I'm not saying that they're impossible. And then one other thing, what really helps is numbers. I mean, many organizations will always say, we cannot find them, those female water experts. So train them. I think fellowships programs targeted at women, train many, and of course there you start with the young ones, but having numbers, in the end, the magic 30% will make the difference.
Right, so fantastic. Okay,
Can I add a bit on this? I think it's really interesting. The Dutch government fund these Nuffic niche projects, which I think have a dual objective. One is to add an interdisciplinary perspective into water education in higher technical institutions in the developing South. And gender is a very important component of all these projects. And I'm engaged on a couple of these different projects in different parts of the world, for example, in Vietnam and in Bangladesh. And what I see is very interesting examples of entrenched inequalities that exist that make it really difficult for women. I mean, if we are asking about where are these women and why are there so few women, I think the answers lie in looking at some of these projects. For example, in Bangladesh, the few female engineering students that we met at these engineering campuses talked about the fact that how difficult it was for them to convince not just their families but also the neighbors, etc., the societal pressure on why they wanted to be engineers, because engineering is a very male-dominated topic. And it was very interesting to note that these girls who still fought and made it up to the college level found that at the university or the education level, college level, they get the same treatment from their professors, where they almost get a subtle message from the lecturers saying, yeah, sure, you're here, but this is really not that important for you, because in the end you're going to get married and have a family. So, if you try to overachieve, you're seen as somebody really strange. And it's very poignant sort of quotes from these girls saying they have no idea of the struggles that we went through in having arrived here. And instead of the encouragement, what we receive is the fact that we are really not entitled to be engineers. And then you see the cultural aspects take place in places like Bangladesh, where there are different norms and rules on when girl students need to be back in their hostels and when boy students can be back in their hostels, and that has definite sort of impacts on access to public spaces like libraries, etc. And what I found also very interesting was in Vietnam, where on my first visit, the local counterpart professor was explaining to me that this is not Bangladesh. Here you don't see such differences as you would see in South Asia, and here we have 90% of almost 96% of young students enrolling in higher technical education. And yet it was very interesting to meet some of these female faculty who somehow seem to get stuck at the lecturer level, and because, as one of them said to me, I might be a professor here, but at home I am the wife. There are these very critical issues, and so it calls out for the need for multi-pronged approaches to addressing these complexities.
Yeah, and I think because you mentioned the cultural issues, which sort of hits back at me, because I think but also in the Netherlands the water sector is very male dominated, so there is I think also a need to really to look at that, and it's sometimes a bit ironic that we are asked as Dutch water experts to train people out there in to become more gender sensitive, whereas we come from a country and a university here in Wageningen, which is very with only 10% female professors, for instance. So it's an issue here too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Wow. And so coming back to the question, what can embassies, what can the Dutch ministry do? At least I would say, from my experience working in different regions in the world, at least be aware of it is already a big starting point. And I think we were saying earlier taking preliminary steps, baby steps, I would say, is important, and a good gender analysis can indicate these experiences and that women face. And for example, very practical issues can come out, like Deepa mentioned about the library that is open till late but not accessible to women because they have to be back in their hostel. I think another thing that we talked about earlier is also the gender training. It's not only about talking about women and gender relations and stuff over there, but also sensitizing men about their own attitudes. And it's the bigger picture of organizational culture. It's not easy to change an organizational culture, but organizational reviews can reveal a lot, and there's oftentimes a lot of small baby steps that we can take. Unless there's something else to say here, shall we go to the third aspect? Yeah. Can we ask Esther to explain and give a bit of an example there on the issue of technocratic, the water sector being technocratic?
Yes, thank you. What we notice as the Gender and Water Alliance, that in fact we are approached often by people working in the field, by engineers. Please tell us how to mainstream gender. We want to know how. But what Margreet explained, the language engineers use is technocratic, and they also need to be taken seriously. What you often see is that gender experts who have been working in, let's say, health or violence against women, they use concepts and language which does not appeal to water engineers or technical people at all. They come with big frameworks and big questionnaires, and engineers just don't have the time for that. They are not socially trained, and they are open to find out how it affects their work and how they can do their work better by taking gender into account, but they are not very much open to doing big questionnaires and social frameworks, etc. So what is very important is to realize that if you are working at an embassy, if you want to mainstream gender or use a gender approach in the water sector, that you need specific tools tailored to technical people. The tools are there, the experts are also there, but you need to be aware of it. So you cannot just hire a gender expert in gender-based violence or in sexual health issues to train water engineers, because there will be a mismatch in language, and water engineers always say it's very important that people understand water. And therefore you need specific expertise on water as well as on gender issues if you want to work with water people to mainstream gender. And there are organizations providing these materials and tools. Of course, my own organization, the Gender and Water Alliance, but also organizations like FAO also target more towards these technical people in their mainstreaming or their gender tools. IFAD also. So please be aware of that.
Use the tools, okay.
Use the proper tools, yes.
And by consulting the right expert, yeah, fantastic. So then we have talked about the three key questions, gender questions in the sector.
Can I add a
yes,
bit on what Esther was saying? And what I wanted to add from my own experience is that, yes, on the one hand, there is an enormous need to make things clear, to make things simple, so that people in certain different sectors can understand and address these issues. On the other hand, I think it's really important to remember that inequality by gender is quite complex, and there is a danger in simplifying beyond this, beyond the reality of the complexities. And for example, there are issues of power, of citizenship, and religion and culture that get enmeshed into what constitutes and creates inequality by gender. So I think it's very important to pay attention also to these issues. In my own work, I found that it has always helped to first begin by talking about poverty and inequality, and to somehow develop this picture of how the poor are certainly not equal. And when you begin with such an image, then it becomes slightly more socially acceptable to then talk about how, for example, not all households are equal, and therefore it becomes more easy to talk about how there is inequality also within a household. And I think it's important to pay attention to both these issues.
Yeah, and at the same time, I think there's also an important opportunity, because a lot is changing right now in the water sector. The water sector is very dynamic, and a lot is changing, and there's a lot of calls for adaptive water management, integrated water management, and many of these calls are also calling for new kinds of knowledge. More attention to complexity, more realization that we cannot know everything, that we cannot control everything, much more attention to social dimensions. So I think there's a real opportunity for gender expertise also to be taken more seriously and to be incorporated.
Great, and on top of it, nobody is a gender and water expert after just one water course. So there's always opportunities to seek support. So where to go for support?
Yeah, well, that is of course how we would like to end this very small gender and water session, is to point at a few ways at what embassies could do, or where they could go for knowledge or for help to do gender or to address women's rights or in water projects. Can I first ask, because when I was preparing this course, I was talking to someone from the ministry actually, and she said, well, you should talk to the Gender and Water Alliance, because right now they are having a very interesting new and creative project in Bangladesh with the embassy to really pay attention to gender in all their water projects. So, and Esther knows a lot about this. It's still in the starting phase, but it sounds like an exciting new approach to deal with gender in water. So, Esther, if you can talk a little bit about it.
Yes. Well, it is in fact really quite fresh. We started in officially 1st of July 2013. We are now in beginning of November. What we are trying to do in Bangladesh, the Embassy of the Netherlands in Bangladesh has a lot of programs in the water sector, because Bangladesh is one of the spear points for water. And they have asked the Gender and Water Alliance to help them mainstream gender in all these projects, because these projects, some are very technical, some are not so technical, but they recognize that there is a need for gender aspects to be dealt with. So what we are trying to do now is we've started a program where we will gather the managers of all these different programs and assist them in mainstreaming gender in their own work. So we will not come in and work in all these different projects ourselves, but we will have a program to help them to help themselves. So we will ask them, like, where are your problems, what do you need, and also let them exchange between each other what their successes are, where they can assist each other, for example. And we do that by different strategies. We have this networking strategy really as one pillar of our program, where the different water programs exchange with each other. Of course, there is a capacity building component. We will train people, be it in gender and IWRM, gender in WASH, gender in agriculture, gender in climate change, and we will use mixed groups from different programs. So there again you have the exchange of information and experience. We will also have a component of gathering all information that is there already, because there often is a lot which is not gathered in a central place. And on the basis of that we can see, like, where are the gaps, what is there already, and we will try to fill those gaps as well. by doing case studies or research or whatever. And another important thing is to take it a bit broader than not only the programs of the embassy, which are quite a lot, I think 15 in total, is a communication strategy. So where we will publicize the results we get or the programs get, and exchange with politicians, and try to also use this for advocacy, for more attention for gender in policies if necessary. And we will do that with the broad society of the Bangladesh world, so to say. So not only focusing on these programs of the embassy, but also working together with university, institutes, whoever is interested can join and share whatever the information they have as well. So we are really excited about this. We have just started, and the main thing is like explained earlier, we really specifically use tools dealing with water professionals. And the other thing I forgot.
Definitely. So this sounds like could be a very inspiring new way of addressing gender, and not flying in experts from all over the world, but really grounding it in the country itself, using local expertise and through a very creative networking strategy.
Yes.
So that could be one interesting way of dealing with it.
Yeah, and what I'd like to add is that we have our members in Bangladesh, and even if they are not working with the embassy, they are still also involved in this program, because they also are there having their gender expertise and their water expertise as well.
Yeah, so that's another way of really grounding it. Yeah. So shall I go first to Saskia, because Saskia works with the Dutch Sustainability Unit, and that is also a unit embassies can go to, if I understand it well. If they have, if they want to do something with gender, they can knock on your door.
Exactly. Yes, they can knock on the door. They can call. They can email. That's correct. So while on the one hand, and most of you will be aware, the ministry takes gender issues and women's rights very seriously these days, and for example pays a lot of attention to sexual reproductive health and rights, and for example new attention to child marriage and sexual violence issues. The ministry also wants to pay more attention to women's rights in the water sector itself, and basically it's suggesting two different ways. On the one hand, integrating women's rights into existing projects, into other new projects in the water sector, and at the same time coming up with women's rights projects within the water sector. So projects that are specifically targeting women's rights or gender equality, but within the context of water. And so for that reason, and to provide support to the embassies, the ministry recently started a gender facility, currently called the Dutch Sustainability Unit for Gender Equality, and hosted by the Netherlands Commission for Environmental Assessment. But that may change in future. So the idea there is to provide support for those kind of last minute questions that there's no time left and there's maybe no resources to hire the private sector, and for which you may normally or might have in the past preferred to ask gender experts at the ministry itself, but for which maybe there's no gender expert available at this time. So basically we are there for all these kind of last minute questions, to help you basically embed these questions that we talked about into project design and program design, project implementation, evaluation, etc. So on the one hand, I'm thinking about, what we all talked about, doing a good gender analysis to make sure these kind of things, these aspects that Deepa, Esther, Magé talked about come to the forefront, and that way you can plan, program your activities. But we can also help, for example, with the identification of stakeholders. What stakeholders to choose? Are there any groups, for example, working on gender and water in this particular country? And of course the translation into results frameworks, which is of course important, or the new gender marker by the European Union, to which about which the ministry has to report. If there's any questions there, we can provide the support. So what does it very concretely look like? We can facilitate access to experts through our gender expert pool. Experts, both local experts as well as international experts. We can assist with the formulation of terms of references for a particular assignment that is undertaken by us, but also we can, for example, review terms of references for studies that are conducted or undertaken by the embassy itself or by the private sector. Evaluations, we can support the formulation of terms of reference for evaluations, for contextual analysis, etc. We can help review or develop monitoring frameworks and the results indicators, or review other documents such as the multi-annual strategic plans, and we have recently reviewed several of them and produced reports: Rwanda, Great Lakes, Benin and Mozambique, all of which have a water component and for which we provided suggestions on how to pay attention to gender equality within their water projects. We also reviewed, for example, some tender documents of an upcoming water project of one of the embassies in Africa, and we can help with studies and analysis review of these documents, for example. And to make it easy, there's no contractual arrangements. We do the contractual arrangements with the experts. We also provide some quality control and do the evaluation of these assignments.
Thank you, Saskia. So that is really making life easy for
that's
for
at least
people.
the intention, exactly. Yes.
So that is I think that is very good because it's often people cannot become. Not everyone can become gender experts and gender and water experts. So it's very good to know, oh, there are places where we can go to. There are people out there who can help, who can provide assistance, and not just in the Netherlands, but in many other countries. So with that, I would like to give the last word to Deepa.
I'd like to add two things. I think taking from what Esther was speaking about, looking back into what has been done, and I think now focusing on what Saskia was talking about, the new focus on and attention to gender and women's rights. And I think really there is a very rich history and tradition of the Dutch government having taken up gender in very radical ways in different countries, especially on water projects. And that brings my attention to India, where the Dutch Development Agency were amongst the first to start doing pretty radical transformatory things like training women as hand pump mechanics. I know it doesn't sound radical or transformatory anymore because it's done on such a large-scale basis, but at the time that it started, it was a big thing, putting the tools in women's hands in situations where they had never been, that such a thing was completely unthought of. And I think also in India, something that is really acknowledged to the Dutch government's work on gender is looking at the intersect of gender and caste, and looking at Dalit women and their, sort of exclusion from water spaces and water access. And I think there is enormous value in, thinking radically and thinking a little bit differently and thinking, towards the future into and continuing to keep the momentum on such things. And I was involved in a Dutch Development Corporation funded project which was implemented and managed by Wageningen, which was a 5-year capacity building initiative of 5 different universities in South Asia, where the idea was to integrate gender into the education, into research, and also into the organizational culture of these higher education technical universities. And what sticks in my mind is what a professor from Chennai said about the fact that when initially the male professors, were identified to be sent for gender training, they were quite angry. they were really not happy, and they felt that this was like a punishment to them to be, why on the earth should they be looking at gender? And yet they came back and said that it's made such an enormous impact on how they think about water and projects. And a similar experience by a Bangladeshi professor at an engineering university, who said that we build all these, shelters in cyclone affected areas, and it had never occurred to us that in these spaces will be used by women and men, and by women who need seclusion. And we had never thought about those issues, and such a simple thing came into picture through some of this gender training and orientation. So once again, my emphasis would be to look at different ways and to look at innovative ways, and I think also to really continue the tradition of working on and prioritizing gender.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. I think this provides a very brief snapshot of different gender questions and solutions in water. Thank you.